Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 19 May 2024. It is the 262nd anniversary of the birth of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was born in Rammenau, Saxony, which was then part of the Holy Roman Empire, on this date in 1762. Fichte is often remembered in the histories of philosophy as an intermediate successor as the immediate successor to Kant, I should say, in the German idealist tradition, I should say intermediate between Kant and Hegel. While still as a young man, Fichte wrote an anonymously published Attempt at a Critique of All Revelation. This was in 1792 when Fichte was 32 years old. Many people at the time believed that Kant had written this work, given Kant's earlier critiques of pure reason, practical reason, and judgment. So when Kant denied authorship of the work and identified Fichte as the actual author, Fichte experienced the philosophical equivalent of being an overnight sensation. But Fichte's life was as unsheltered as Kant's life was sheltered. He was a born troublemaker and was willing to touch the third rail of Enlightenment politics by writing and speaking openly about matters of religion, as revealed by his work on Revelation. Fichte is sometimes called inflexible and rigid, though we could also say more sympathetically that he was principled and not inclined to compromise. Fichte became embroiled in a controversy in German intellectual life remembered as the Atheismusstreit, or the atheism controversy. And during this controversy, Friedrich Jacobi published an open letter against Fichte, in which Jacobi coined the term nihilism to describe what he took to be Fichte's position. So this is from Jacobi, quote, "Truly, my dear Fichte, I would not be vexed if you or anyone else were to call chimerism the view I oppose to the idealism that I chide for nihilism. I have paraded my not knowing in all my writings. In my non-knowledge, I have prided myself to be with knowledge so perfectly and completely that I am completely allowed to be contemptuous of the mere doubter. I have wrestled for truth with zeal and fervor since childhood as few others. As few others have I experienced my powerlessness, and my heart has grown tender for that. Yea, very tender, my dear Fichte, and my voice so gentle. Just as I have deep compassion for myself as being human, so I have it for others. I am patient without effort, but I am truly patient without effort costs me a lot. The earth will be a light above me. It won't be long," unquote. Nihilism after that was to go on to quite a career as an idea, although for Jacobi, the nihilism that he attributed to Fichte was an inevitable outcome of the application of reason. But nihilism in its subsequent career did not remain centered on Jacobi's critique of Kantian philosophy, but came to signify a belief in nothing at all. But in any case, that's the origin of nihilism and the atheism controversy in German philosophy. Fichte's controversial stance created a problem for the authorities at the University of Jena, where he was employed. Fichte wouldn't budge, and this is one of the episodes responsible for his reputation for inflexibility. So the University of Jena, without anything else they could think of to do, dismissed him in 1799. At this point, with little to his name and very few prospects, Fichte walked from Jena to Berlin. Google Maps says it takes 55 hours to complete the walk, so presumably it took him a week or two. And eventually he became part of the philosophical scene in Berlin. And Fichte attempted semi-successfully to support himself with popular books and lectures. For a philosopher coming from a background of Kantian philosophy, which was the most technical philosophy of its day, this was, you could say, a bold project, but he gamely attempted to bring his interpretation of Kantianism to the masses. One of the outcomes of this effort was Fichte's short book, The Vocation of Man, which is written in plain language and intended for a popular audience rather than being riddled with the Kantian jargon of his earlier philosophical works. But it's still a demanding philosophical argument, and I suspect that few who heard it as lectures fully understood what was going on. In this, The Vocation of Man, Fichte articulated a conception of human destiny that is universalistic, rationalistic, teleological, and even infinitistic. Quote, "Let us not ask of history if man on the whole have yet become purely moral. To a more extended, comprehensive, energetic freedom he has certainly attained, but hitherto it has been an almost necessary result of his position that his freedom has been applied chiefly to evil purposes. Neither let us ask whether the aesthetic and intellectual culture of the ancient world, concentrated on a few points, may not have excelled in degree that of modern times. It might happen that we should receive a humiliating answer, and that in this respect the human race has not advanced, but rather seemed to retrograde in its riper years. But let us ask of history at what period the existing culture has been most widely diffused and distributed among the greatest number of individuals. And we shall doubtless find that from the beginning of history down to our own day, the few light points of civilization have spread themselves abroad from their center, that one individual after another and one nation after another has been embraced within their circle, and that this wider outspread of culture is proceeding under our own eyes. And this is the first point to be attained in the endless path on which humanity must advance." Unquote. Notice that in this passage, Fichte implies a distinction between two kinds of progress. There is, on the one hand, progress toward the highest degree of excellence, where humanity may have backslid since the ancient times, but there's also progress toward broadly distributed high culture, and here Fichte thinks that his time has definitely surpassed previous history. Fichte also says that progress, by which he means moral progress, is an endless path, and we've already seen that it is possible for humanity to experience retrograde moral progress, as Fichte noted in that passage. So the pathway to man becoming purely moral, as Fichte sees it, is endless. It can incorporate reversals, and it can be striving to new heights or to wider diffusion. This and many other passages point to the infinite perfectibility of man, which shows us the extent to which Fichte had imbibed the ideals of the French Revolution. Although it might be better to say Fichte had imbibed the ideals of the French philosophers who were instrumental in laying the foundations of the French Revolution and were later arguably co-opted by the Revolution, as in the case of Condorcet, for example, who wrote his Paean to the Infinite Perfectibility of Man while on the run from the revolutionary gendarme. But the infinite perfectibility of man, as Fichte imagined it, is a teleology with a real history. Things can go wrong. We can get sidetracked. We might pursue one form of moral excellence or another, and so on. And Fichte also transmuted the French concept of the infinite perfectibility of man in the image of German idealism, producing a kind of philosophical spiritualism. Part of this transformation of ideals came about because of the direction that Fichte saw the French Revolution take after its initial outburst. Many philosophers at the time initially supported the ideals of the French Revolution, but came to see it in a different light after the terror and the Napoleonic War, and Fichte as well. Seeking to rally his countrymen after defeats inflicted by Napoleon, Fichte gave a series of popular lectures that were later published as addresses to the German nation. This was more than a half century before the unification of Germany as a nation state, so we have to keep that in mind. In the 20th century, this work was savaged by George Santayana in his book, Egotism in German Philosophy, which I mentioned in my episode on Wars and Rumors of Wars. Santayana called Fichte an uncompromising Puritan, and in Santayana's fever dream of German expansionism, he imagined Fichte as the source of it all. Quote, "Fichte gives us prophetic glimpses of an idealistic Germany conquering the world. The state does not aim at self-preservation, still less is it concerned to come to the aid of those members of the human family that lag behind the movement of the day. The dominion of unorganized physical force must be abolished by a force obedient to reason and spirit. True life consists in refashioning human relations after a model innate in the mind. The glorious destiny of Germany is to bring forth and establish the world anew. Natural freedom is a disgraceful thing, a mere medley of sensual and intellectual impulses without any principle of order. It is for the Germans to decide whether a providential progress exists by becoming themselves the providence that shall bring progress about, or whether, on the contrary, every higher thought is folly. If they should fail, history would never blame them, for in that case, there would be no more history." Unquote. So that was George Santayana on Fichte, and not a very flattering way to construe his philosophy. Many others have also seen Fichte's work through the lens of the wars of their time, which were usually the wars of the 20th century, rather than through the lens of the wars of Fichte's time, which were the Napoleonic Wars. Fichte knew that he was putting his life on the line by publicly speaking out against the French, as he at one time referenced the fate of Johann Philipp Palm. Palm was connected to a pamphlet, Germany in its Deep Humiliation is the English translation of the title, that had come to the attention of Napoleon and made him angry. And Napoleon ordered his subordinates to try and execute Palm within 24 hours. So Palm was tried on 26 August 1806 by a French military tribunal, was found guilty, and was shot within hours of the verdict, though 4 other booksellers were also tried at this time, and they were not executed. Fichte knew very well that the same thing could happen to him by publicly speaking out on behalf of the German people. So we can see that Fichte was in the thick of the history of his own time. Sometimes he was riding the wave, and sometimes he was making waves. Roberta Picardi notes that the derivation and dependence of Fichte's views from Kant, as well as Fichte's divergence from Kant. Quote, Fichte explores the epistemic status and method of history with an aim which is clearly taken from Kant, the purpose of introducing a systematic and scientific method in the infinite field of the empiricism of which history is a part, together with experimental physics. As we can read in The Characteristics of the Present Age, he wants to obtain a sure progress according to rule instead of an uncertain groping in the dark from history. That is, instead of herumtappen, this is the German word for groping. That in the second preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant contrasts with the secure path of science, unquote. But the secure path of science isn't always all that secure. And given that there are multiple scientific pathways, not all of these pathways are going to lead to the same end. And this is a distinction within Fichte's philosophy of history that has been noted by Angelica Nuzzo. Quote, Fichte builds his idea of philosophy of history upon a paradoxical argument. He pushes to the extreme the acclaim of the bare factual nature of history as a realm of irrational, not conceptual, and thoroughly contingent reality. Yet he also maintains that philosophical knowledge of history is possible, although neither as deductive nor conceptual nor genetic knowledge. Against the fictitious notion of historical Wahrscheinlichkeit, plausibility or probability, Fichte holds on to this notion of historical truth and to its logic. Despite its radically empirical character, history can be construed a priori, unquote. Some of the flavor of Fichte's a priori approach to history can be gained from his primary work on the philosophy of history, The Characteristics of the Present Age, which was published in 1806, the same year that Johann Philipp Palm was executed by Napoleon's forces, in which work Fichte decomposes history into 5 principal epochs based not on historical contingencies, but rather on human destiny and human moral development. Quote, we endeavored to prefigure the whole earthly life of man by a comprehension of its purpose, to perceive why our race had to begin its existence here, and by this means to describe the whole present life of humankind. This is what we wished to do. It was our first task. There are, according to this view, 5 principal epochs of earthly life, each of which, although taking its rise in the life of the individual, must yet, in order to become an epoch of the life of the race, gradually lay hold of and interpenetrate all men, and to that end must endure throughout long periods of time, so that the great whole of life is spread out into ages, which sometimes seems to cross, sometimes to run parallel with each other. First, the epoch of the unlimited dominion of reason as instinct, the state of the innocence of the human race. Second, the epoch in which reason as instinct is changed into external ruling authority, the age of positive systems of life and doctrine, which never go back to their ultimate foundations and hence have no power to convince, but on the contrary, merely desire to compel, and which demand blind faith and unconditional obedience, the state of progressive sin. Third, the epoch of liberation, directly from the external ruling authority, indirectly from the power of reason as instinct, and generally from reason in any form, the age of absolute indifference toward all truth and of entire and unrestrained licentiousness, the state of completed sinfulness. Fourth, the epoch of reason as knowledge, the age in which truth is looked upon as the highest and loved before all other things, the state of progressive justification. Fifth, the epoch of reason as art, the age in which humanity with more sure and unerring hand builds itself up into a fitting image and representative of reason, the state of completed justification and sanctification. Thus, the whole progress which upon this view humanity makes here below is only a retrogression to the point on which it stood at first and has nothing in view save that return to its original condition. But humanity must make this journey on its own feet. By its own strength, it must bring itself back to that state in which it was once, before, without its own cooperation, in which for that very purpose it must first of all leave, unquote. So, in other words, in my beginning is in my end is in my beginning. We can call Fichte's Five Principle Epochs a stadial philosophy of history, since stadial refers to stages. It's a convenient term for it. In this passage, we gain an appreciation of the necessity of the five stages of history as a developmental process that cannot be gotten around. We could say that there is no royal road to the end of history. Fichte isn't in the least interested to give even an estimate of the period of time it will be required for humanity to abolish all government and attain moral purity, but he only points this out as the ultimate end. Marx also predicted the withering away of the state after communism had been achieved, and Marx too emphasized definite stages in human development that would lead to this outcome. With Kant, Fichte, and Marx all predicting the end of formal human governments, we might take this prediction as a distinctive feature of a certain class of philosophies of history. Toynbee, too, saw not exactly the end of the state, but the end of universal civilizations, which would cede their place to universal churches, which sounds to me a lot like Kant, Fichte, and Marx anticipating the ultimate abolition of government in a perfect society. This we can understand as a kind of inverse teleology, which it is not only the advent of some future eventuality, but the abolition of some present state of affairs in the future as the goal of human development. For Kant, Fichte, Marx, and Toynbee, there is a dual teleological movement in which some novel state of affairs is to unfold, while the present state of affairs is to give way and disappear as a new order comes to replace it. We could call this a stadial philosophy of history, but it is as much a substitutional philosophy of history because one social order is being substituted for another. Familiar institutions are to be replaced by novel institutions that take their place. As far as the new institutions are expected to be an improvement over the old, this is also a melioristic or improving philosophy of history. All progressivist philosophies of history are also melioristic, but we can distinguish between gradualistic meliorism, in which iterated reform eventually converges on a perfect society, or for Fichte, perfect morality, which could be a finite or an infinitistic process, and stadial meliorism, in which there is a replacement rather than a reform of social order, and this replacement is an improvement. For a non-stadial, non-teleological philosophy of history, we can turn to Leopold von Ranke, who is critical of Fichte's five epochs. Quote, "One of the ideas with which philosophy again and again confronts history is an irrefutable claim is that mankind is on an uninterrupted road to progress in a steady development toward perfection. Fichte, one of the foremost philosophers in this field, assumes five epochs, a world plan, as he says, reason ruling through instinct, reason ruling through law, emancipation from the authority of reason, reason as science, and reason as art. If this or a similar scheme were to be to any extent true, then general history would have to follow the road of progress which the human race followed in the indicated direction from one age to the next. The sole subject matter of history would then be the development of such concepts as they appear and manifest themselves in the world of phenomena. But this is by no means the case. For one thing, the philosophers themselves have extraordinarily varied opinions about the nature and selection of these supposedly ruling ideas. but they very wisely focused only on a few peoples in the world history while considering the lives of all the rest as nothing, as a mere supplement. Otherwise, it could not be hidden for a moment from the beginning to this day, the peoples of the world have been in the most varied conditions, unquote. That was, again, Leopold von Ranke on Fichte's five stages of history. And we saw earlier that Fichte by no means argued for an uninterrupted road to progress. I said this was a real history in which there could be reversals. But we can set that aside as of secondary importance, because the antagonism between Fichte and Ranke runs deeper. Ranke is often associated with the emergence of historicism, and sometimes he is identified as the source of historicism. And Ranke was even willing to express his historicism in theological terms when he said that all ages are equidistant from God. With this view of history as consisting of co-equal periods, each with their own integrity, it would be difficult, though not impossible, to argue for progress. In Characteristics of the Present Age, Fichte rejects the view that an age can be assessed on its own terms. Quote, should our view of the present age prove to have been a view taken from the standing point of this age itself, should the eye which has taken this view have been itself a product of the age which it has surveyed, then has the age borne witness to itself, and such testimony may be set aside, unquote. Fichte then needs some criterion for his view of the present age other than the present age itself, and he finds it in religion. Quote, what has been the nature of this theory considered in its essential elements, and to what chief department of human thought has it belonged? I answer, it was a religious theory. All our contemplations were religious contemplations, and our view of things, the eye of which embraced that view, were religious, unquote. Fichte goes one better and actually gives a definition of religion in the next paragraph. Quote, religion consists in regarding and recognizing all earthly life as a necessary development of the one original, perfectly good and perfectly blessed divine life, unquote. Both Ranke and Fichte then invoke the theological sanction for their conception of history, though this conception is starkly different, with Ranke taking each age to be sufficient unto itself, with no less related to the divine than any other age, while Fichte took each age to be dependent upon a larger framework for its meaning. While Ranke, the historian, insists on the individual uniqueness of each age, Fichte, the philosopher, sees each age in relation to the whole of which it is part. It is the task of Fichte's book, Characteristics of the Present Age, to provide his contemporaries this larger framework so they can understand their place of history, which for Fichte means understanding their place in the moral development of humanity. Even Fichte's conception of moral development is highly abstract. In the second lecture from Fichte's Some Lectures Concerning the Scholar's Vocation, he makes explicit the a priori developmental history of humanity, while at the same time presenting a utopian picture of the end of human development. Quote, a very great man has said, life in the state is not one of man's absolute aims. The state is instead only a means for establishing a perfect society, a means which exists only under specific circumstances. Like all those human institutions which are mere means, the state aims at abolishing itself. The goal of all government is to make government superfluous. Though the time was certainly not yet to come, nor do I know how many myriads or myriads of years it may take, here we are not at all concerned with applicability in life, but only with justifying a speculative position. There will certainly be a point in the a priori foreordained career of the human species when all civic bonds will become superfluous, unquote. This is to what I was referring when I said earlier that Fichte predicted the end of human government. And the editor of the book that this appears, one of the books this appears in, says in a footnote that the great man mentioned in this project, in this passage, was probably an allusion to Kant's idea of history from a cosmological point of view, from a cosmopolitan point of view, excuse me. And we saw in my episode on Kant how Kant saw the teleology of humanity as establishing the perfect civil constitution, though I speculated beyond that if we take Kant's later writings on history in the context of his earlier pre-critical work on natural history, this Kantian teleology for humanity is nested within a larger cosmological teleology. By my reading, then, Kant is actually the more naturalistic position, while Fichte is the more anthropocentric, and his ideal is a purely spiritual idea, even an a priori idea. Fichte gives a strikingly abstract account of religion a little further on in the last chapter of Characteristics of the Present Age. Quote, "Religion is nothing external. It never clothes itself in any outward manifestation," unquote. And, quote, "True religion does not manifest itself outwardly and does not impel man to any course of external conduct which he would not otherwise have adopted, but that it only completes his true inward being and dignity," unquote. This is not necessarily an orthodox position, but we've already seen how Fichte got himself in trouble with the authorities with his views on religion. It would seem strange to call Fichte's philosophy of history a providential philosophy of history, as it seems to have very little in common with a philosophy like Augustine's. But by Fichte's own account, his is a pervasively religious perspective, and his philosophy of history is an account of humanity's progress toward moral perfection. This progress is a purely inward fulfillment without any observational consequences, again, by Fichte's own account. I've run into this view in one other thinker, and that is Simone Weil. In my episode on Weil, I quoted her criticism of providentialism that I called vulgar providentialism. Quote, "Divine providence is not a disturbing influence, an anomaly in the ordering of the world. It is itself the order of the world, or rather, it is the regulating principle of the universe. It is eternal wisdom, unique, spread across the whole universe in a sovereign network of relations," unquote. So that was Simone Weil. And I think that Fichte would have agreed with this. And with the example of both Fichte and Weil, we can see that there is a place within the conceptual space of philosophy of history for what we could call a pure providential philosophy of history. Ronca's criticism of Fichte implies the necessity of a vulgar providentialism that is reflected in the empirical world. But if, as Fichte said, religion is nothing external, and it does not impel men to any course of external conduct, neither should it impel any course of external conduct on the world. This also resolved the paradoxical argument that Angelica Nuzzo found at the heart of Fichte's philosophy of history, since the bare factual nature of history can be distinguished from the providentialism that can be construed a priori. So happy birthday, Fichte, and thanks for listening.